Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CAL FIRE Office of the State Fire Marshal's Community Wildfire Preparedness and Mitigation webinar. My name is Kara Garrett, and I will be the moderator of this series. This webinar will last about 30 minutes and will be recorded. Please type any questions into the Q&A portion of the screen, and we will answer those questions as soon as possible. After our featured speaker has completed their presentation, we will be holding a question and answer session. If you have any questions after the webinar has concluded, we will also be providing contact information for the program to allow you to reach out to them directly. And all webinar documentation, including the PDF of the PowerPoint, recording of this webinar, and all related documentation discussed during this presentation will be available at our website at osfm.fire.ca.gov/wildfire-public-education/. That is also in your chat right now. But should you encounter any issues during this webinar, please do not hesitate to give me a call at 916-201-5539 or send me an email at kara.garrett@fire.ca.gov. So today's webinar will focus on fire hazard severity zones, and to get us started, I will have Deputy Director Daniel Berlant say a few words. So take it away, Chief.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. And first off, thank you for taking the time to join us this morning for such an important topic. We have been working for a number of years now to remap our fire hazard severity zones. And so I look forward to our staff and our team being able to update you on that process and really continue to inform you on what fire hazard severity zones mean and in reality what they don't mean. In the past 5 years, California has experienced not only some of the largest wildfires in our recorded history, but some of the most destructive. And so as we work to prepare communities for wildfires and mitigate those risks, it's critical that we're using the most up-to-date science to rank California's hazards, and more importantly, so that you know your area's risk, I should say hazard, so that you know your area's hazard and can take the steps to prepare your own families and your neighborhoods for wildfire. So thank you again for joining us this morning. I'll turn it back over to Kara so we can jump right into it.
Thank you, Chief. So again, this webinar, right screen, 1 second. Okay, so this webinar, the purpose is to educate and discuss community wildfire preparedness, mitigation, fire safety topics directly with our staff. And for more information, that is the link right there on your screen. And I will go ahead and kick it over now to our presenter, Deputy Chief Scott Witt, to introduce himself and share information about fire hazard severity zones. So go ahead, Chief.
All right, let me go ahead and share my screen, and that should be good. So I wanted to give everybody a quick update on the status of our fire hazard severity zone remap. Our current fire hazard severity zone maps were created in the late 2000s. So those are the current and effective maps, and they're going to be updated by a regulatory process beginning this December. The webinar that you're attending right now will talk about those fire hazard severity zones in state responsibility area. We aren't at the point where we're rolling these out for fire hazard severity zones in local responsibility area. So only SRA, not LRA yet. These new maps are going to be circulated for public comment in the next couple weeks. And they're going to include a full suite of informational resources, web pages, web maps, different tools to help view and understand the data. And then the new fire hazard severity zone maps in the SRA fall under the authority of the State Fire Marshal, and that's defined within Public Resources Code. So I wanted to give some definitions about what fire hazard severity zones are and where they're effective. And the first place that I wanted to start was give a quick explanation on what responsibility area is and how that relates to fire hazard severity zones. So when we talk about responsibility area, there are three types. There's federal local, and state responsibility area. And what that means is who has the legal responsibility to prevent, suppress, and investigate wildfires. And responsibility areas are defined by the Public Resource Code, section 4125 to 4137. It's easiest to start with federal responsibility area, and FRA is effectively all lands owned by the federal government. And you can see that on the map in green. The next area that I wanted to talk about are local responsibility areas. Generally, these are going to be incorporated cities and unincorporated lands that are not considered watershed. So we're talking about ag land, we're talking about urbanized land, and you can see that on the map, the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, the urbanized Bay Area, the urbanized Los Angeles and San Diego basins. Finally, that leaves us to state responsibility area. State responsibility area is generally more rural, and it's wildlands, typically with grasslands, brushlands, or timber covered lands. SRA represents about a third of the state, and there are about 1 million residences within state responsibility area. And most importantly, this is the area that we're updating with a cycle that we expect to start in December. Let's take a little look at Fire Hazard Severity Zone history. Fire Hazard Severity Zones have existed for about 40 years. They were legislated in the 1980s in response to some large and damaging wildfires. They were updated again in the 1990s, specifically to add lands within local responsibility area. And then they were updated again in the 2000s. The map that you see on the screen right now is an example of the current maps. This happens to show the city of Morgan Hill, an incorporated city within Santa Clara County. So those maps are circa 2007. And you can see by that map, they're showing 3 primary areas in state responsibility areas. They're showing red, which is very high. They're showing orange, which is high, and they're showing moderate in yellow. An important thing to remember is all lands that are state responsibility area are zoned. So every land in SRA will have a corresponding fire hazard severity zone. This includes water bodies, ag, and barren lands. And an example that I'm pointing to on the map, you can see east of Morgan Hill, Coyote Lake is zoned at that minimum level at moderate. So what are our time frames? The new fire hazard severity zone maps in SRA will be circulated for public comment in December. And again, this will include a full suite of informational resources. CAL FIRE is also required to conduct 1 public hearing in each county that has SRA. There are 58 counties within California. 56 of those counties have SRA. The 2 counties that do not have SRA are Sutter and San Francisco counties. Therefore, they will not be part of this fire hazard severity zone SRA remap. The current fire hazard severity zone maps remain in effect until this regulatory process concludes. And LRA remap of fire hazard severity zone should initiate in the middle of next year, and they follow a process outlined in government code. Let's look at the authority behind fire hazard severity zones in SRA. And that's derived from the Public Resources Code, section 4201 to 4204. This is a very tight section of the code. It's very easy to read. 4201 provides for the classification of lands within SRA. 4202 says the state fire marshals shall classify those lands, and they will classify using factors. 4203A says that it shall be designated by regulation. 4203B provides that we will transmit those findings to the County Board of Supervisors and also include public hearings. 4204 states that the state fire marshal shall periodically review those zones, and that's exactly what this review process is entailing. Looking at a partial list of factors involved in the remap, we look at things like fuel loading, slope, fire weather, fire history, and the transmission and reception of firebrands. New to this remap includes areas where winds have been identified as a major cause of wildfire spread. And as I just said, this is a brand new factor. An important distinction with fire hazard severity zones is separating hazard from risk. And as the name implies, fire hazard severity zones concentrate exclusively on hazard and do not score for risk. And risk talks about how much damage will occur. Hazard, on the other hand, talks about the likelihood of a damaging event. So in other words, the likelihood of a wildfire occurring within a specific area. Hazard is weighted by things like the frequency of wildfires, the flame length that those wildfires might exhibit, and the transmission or reception of firebrands. Hazard doesn't change much, and our CAL FIRE maps take a very long-term look at these hazards, typically a 30 to 50-year look across the landscape. And an example of things that don't change that much for our hazard maps, including steep topography and hot, dry, windy areas. Risk, on the other hand, is how much damage might occur if a damaging event, a wildfire burns through an area. Risk can change very frequently, and it can change for the better or worse. An example is immediate change with risk mitigation. So if there's dead and dry grass growing around a structure, cutting that dry grass back immediately reduces the risk. It's reducing how much damage might occur to that structure because of a wildfire. Another example of an immediate change in risk is rainy weather. Known hazards like steep topography and those hot, dry winds can feed into risk and how much damage might occur. And the purpose of these maps is to show that hazard in a standard way across the state. So high fire hazard severity zones in Yuba County should be functionally equal to a high fire hazard severity zone in Fresno County. It's important to understand that risk mitigation is not weighted in our fire hazard severity zone maps. I'm going to give some examples of risk mitigation and examples of contrary events that would overwhelm those risk mitigation efforts. So you can have areas that have fuel treatments, and a contrary event might be that the fuel treatment may not occur on that property every year. Defensible space. Homeowners may not complete or comply with defensible space requirements every year. Having a well-staffed fire department is a risk mitigation. However, they may be on another emergency. Water supply is a good example of risk mitigation, but there could be a power outage or drought that would limit or eliminate water supply. And roads, being able to move people away from a hazard. However, over time, additional traffic impacts, in other words, more residents, cause that risk mitigation to erode over time. And to recap, CAL fire hazard maps do not account for risk mitigation. Our fire hazard severity zone maps are designed to look across the landscape over a 30 to 50-year time frame. So what are the fire hazard severity zone uses in SRA? Not much is changing in SRA. Ongoing uses include things like Chapter 7A and those building code requirements. Those are required in all zones in SRA, whether it's very high, high, or moderate. The same is the case with our fire safe regulations, again, required in all zones. Defensible space clearance and inspections that are outlined in Public Resources Code 4291. Those are also required within all zones in SRA. A relatively new change, but it is still existing, is real estate hazard disclosures. That was prompted by the passage of Assembly Bill 38. The effective date of that Assembly Bill was in January of 2021. And that outlines that those disclosures are requirements in very high and high fire hazard severity zones with the sale of real estate. There are a lot of additional resources available. I'm going to go over those in just a second. Those resources are available within the web link that you see in the screen, as well as that same web link that was copied and pasted into chat. Those new web resources that are going to be made available in the next couple weeks are going to include videos explaining the science behind fire hazard severity zones, as well as some of the impacts that the fire hazard severity zones will have. Those web resources are going to include frequently asked questions. Those web resources are going to include web maps. I'm going to show some of those current web maps in just a second. Additional support tools like how to request inspection because of the requirements from Assembly Bill 38, as well as regulatory information and the ease of and the facilitating of making public comment. So I'll go ahead and grab that screen back right now. And I've started by bringing up that web link. That web link redirects to CAL FIRE's Fire Hazard Severity Zone webpage. As we roll out the new maps, as we roll out the new tools, that web link that's posted in chat will automatically be updated with the new web resources. So this is the current web link, and you can see that we've got several different quick links available. I'm going to highlight some of those right now. Probably the one that is the most sought after is the Fire Hazard Severity Zone viewer. I'll open that, and as that web page loads up, you can see that it's got a legend. It shows very high zones in local responsibility area. It shows all 3 zones within state responsibility area, and it also shows the differences of federal, local, and state responsibility area. You can toggle those layers on and off using this eyeball. So if I want to remove responsibility area, I can do that, and that leaves just the underlying zones. I'm going to explore that a little bit more in just a second. I'm going to start by choosing an address in the Santa Clara unit. I'm copying and pasting an address on the eastern side of the city of Morgan Hill. I've pasted that into the address search bar, and I'm going to hit the magnifying glass to zoom to that location. And in zooming into it, now I'm going to get a little bit more creative with how I'm displaying that information. So I'm going to go back to the layer visibility tool, and I'm going to turn off the fire hazard severity zones and turn on the responsibility area. And I can see that it shows in yellow, so it's just outside of LRA, local responsibility area, which happens to be the incorporated city of Morgan Hill. And that address looks like it lands within local responsibility area on the edge of Anderson Lake. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, and it does indeed look like it lands within state responsibility area. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my view from a street view to a satellite view. And by using that aerial imagery, I can confirm that the push pin that was dropped on that address is representative of the house in question. So now I'll go ahead and turn off responsibility area and turn on fire hazard severity zones. And I can see that it is within a yellow area. So by default, it is a moderate in state responsibility area, and it will have to follow the rules and requirements for fire hazard severity zones within SRA. I'll show a few more features on our existing fire hazard severity zone webpage. You can see that we've got frequently asked questions. These questions will prime you with information as the new maps roll out within the next couple weeks. In addition to the viewer, which I just showed, we also have those maps available as PDF maps. And if I click on that, again, these are the maps circa late 2000s. I can view by county. So in that same area, I can go to the Santa Clara County. I can expand that. I can see that I've got maps for the 6 incorporated cities within Santa Clara that have very high, as well as the state responsibility area maps. I also have GIS data available. And again, these are the older current maps circa the late 2000s. As we roll the new maps out, the maps proposed will be displayed, as well as the existing maps. And as a reminder, the existing maps circa late 2000s remain effective until the regulatory process concludes. Also looking at this page, we've got resources available if you do need a defensible space inspection as the requirements from Assembly Bill 38. We've got web links and resources available to help you secure that. So the remainder of this page talks about what the different frequently asked questions are, questions that you may have right now. What are the zones? How are they determined? When were the maps last updated? The updating process that is ongoing right now. Some of the different building standards within SRA and the questions related off of that. Again, all of these web pages are going to be updated as we roll out the new maps as part of the regulatory process. At this point in time, I'll turn the meeting back over to Kara. I'll stop sharing and we can look at any of the questions that may be of interest from the attendees.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, so now we will be taking some questions, and the contact information for Chief Witt is right there, and your resources link is right there as well. As I mentioned, this PDF will be available on our website after this presentation concludes. We do have about 6 more minutes, so that's enough time, I think, for about 3 questions. But if we do not get to your questions, please feel free to send us an email with that question. Go ahead and put your hand up if you do have a question. You do have that feature, should have that feature in Zoom. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get to you, or please type it into the question and answer box. And right now we do not have any open questions. Okay, I do see someone's hands up. Let me get to you. Okay, so John Miller, go ahead.
How do you how are you going to address climate change with the fourth climate assessment by the state? There's a statement that the areas affected by wildfire are expected to increase in the future. So how are the updates to fire hazard severity zones going to address the climate change?
I can jump on that question. So one of the new elements that I showed within the slideshow, identified within Public Resources Code, is the additional wind and climate data. Effectively, if you imagine a 2-kilometer grid draped over the entire state, all 100 million acres, every one of those 2-kilometer cells has a predicted and projected maximum value. So effectively, what is that possible hot and dry climate, that wind event that would elevate a fire hazard severity zone or reduce a fire hazard severity zone. And if you could imagine some of the coastal areas that have a very heavy marine influence, the assumption is those areas would receive possibly a lower score over the previous map that did not take these climatological models into effect, and areas of the state that are hotter, that are drier, that are windier. Imagine those areas where you see windmills. Those would probably tend to receive a more elevated rating. So it's a backward looking model for what the wind patterns were, and a forward looking model on what the wind patterns, the climatological patterns are predicted to be. Again, this is a long-term fuel model, and it looks to project out in that 30 to 50 year time frame.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, and we have one more question. It is 11:57, so we have about 3 more minutes. So let's move on to Todd Ferrara with Tejon Ranch. I will go ahead and unmute you.
Thank you. Chief, how would you broadly characterize the changes you're seeing in the maps that are currently established, the late 2000s, versus what you will be releasing in the coming weeks?
I think what we're going to find on the maps is what we've seen anecdotally with our recent fire history. And as these maps were made in the late 2000s in a direct response to the fires of the early 2000s, specifically, I'm thinking the Cedar Fire in San Diego, at the time the largest wildfire in state history. It burnt a little over 250,000 acres. It burnt almost 3,000 structures. I was on that fire. That fire felt like it should have been the largest fire of my career. And when we look at what we've experienced over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen those fires increase in size exponentially, increase in damage exponentially, increase in lives lost exponentially. And I believe what we're seeing in the model generally is reflective of that. We're seeing the hotter, drier, windier patterns will probably lift many of these areas into a higher classification. And as I mentioned on the earlier question, areas that might be part of a stagnant air basin, areas that might see more of a marine influence, areas that might be sheltered from from a damaging wind event might see their ratings drop slightly. And as we roll these maps out, one tool that we anticipate having on our webpage is a change viewer, where you will be able to see what the difference is between the maps that are currently in use from the late 2000s to the new maps that we look to roll out in December.
Perfect. Thank you, Chief. Okay, so the time is now noon, and I will go ahead and wrap up this webinar. You all got the link right here. So this is where you can find your resources for fire hazard severity zones. More information is on there, as well as contact information. So our next webinar will be held on December 12th, and it will feature our damage inspection program. Very excited about that. That will start at 11th or on the 12th of December. And if you have any questions or if you want any more information, that is the link to that webinar page. And I will go ahead and stop this webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week.